I have. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's a great to have an opportunity and to respond to Chia, who has set me quite a challenge in terms of covering. Okay, it's that way. Is okay. In terms of explaining what happened in Katowice, setting out the EU's 2050 strategy and responding to those questions. So first of all, I've been working in Beijing for about, 4.5 years now, and we work very closely with the Chinese government. In the summer, we issued a leaders' statement on climate and clean energy. Li Keqiang, with the presidents of the Commission and the Council, set out the vision for our cooperation. And I think it's worth looking at that statement because it's a very clear statement of how important this is, both for the EU and China, and it sets out how important we see this as two big blocks and how our commitments are very close in terms of addressing this challenge. I wanted to start off with, this is the youth voice that was at the COP, and I think what is happening now, there's a very rapid change in society, and for that I agree with Chia. We're really looking at a cultural change where things are moving ahead very fast. And so while we've had yellow vest protests in Paris, which from my perspective are not about climate policy, but more about redistribution and a situation which is seen to be unfair in financial terms for lower class, middle class sections of society. So more about how you do policy as to whether you do climate policy or not. What we do have, and that's been less talked about, is every Thursday in Brussels, you will see that children are skipping school to go and protest in the streets. And we're not seeing that, but maybe because they're a little less violent than their older counterparts in Paris. In terms of the climate challenges, this is from the European perspective, and this is what is driving the debate right now. It's been covered in quite a lot of detail, so I won't go into it. But just to say that this is something that really does drive the debate in Europe. And if climate is one of the major priorities of the European Union, it's because it's also impacting Europe very heavily, as well as the rest of the world. And Robert also went through the different IPCC pathways. I think what's important to note, we need to be CO2 neutral by 2050, according to these strategies. But we have a little bit more room to deal with the other gases. But the vision I'm going to present to you in a little while for the EU wants to lead and become all greenhouse gas neutral by 2050, to show what can be done. But first of all, I wanted to have a look at the Paris Agreement because it's been the subject of the previous presentation, and I wanted to go through some of the aspects which make it such a groundbreaking agreement. First of all, it is a bottom-up agreement. I know that it has a treaty which is legally binding. What is not legally binding are the nationally determined contributions which are in an annex. And that was a compromise which was reached to allow the US to be at the table. And the US being at the table make sure that China was at the table and everybody else was at the table. And so we had to find a way of making that happen. And so we have a legally binding agreement in terms of the large part of the text, but what nations have committed themselves to does not bind them in terms of meeting those targets in a legal form, but they have lots of other things around that they have to do. And one of the important things is being transparent. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the rulebook adopted in Paris. This was mentioned. The rulebook was necessary to put the big elements of the big principles of the Paris Agreement agreed in 2015 into practice to make it work. And what this is really about, and we'll talk about it a bit on the next slide, is understanding where we are, what we've done, and where we can go in the future. So it's a continuous cycle of improvement that takes us forward to meet the targets, because it's very clear the NDCs, the commitments made prior to the Paris Agreement in 2015, do not get us to where we need to be. We need to do far more, and the Paris Agreement sets up a process to get everybody collectively onto that path. And it does so by putting peer pressure on individual parties, but also by showing them what's possible, coming up with the latest information, both on the science, but also what the technologies and policies can do. It's a very large multilateral and multi-sector, multi-issue agreement, And it covers the mitigation, which is what people talk about a lot, but it also covers adaptation, response measures, how you get onto a fair transition for everybody in society. It covers markets, finance, very important in terms of shifting finance in the right direction, but it's also technology, capacity building, and of course the science underlying it, and very important also land use, and that's becoming much, much more important for the future. It has a 5-year cycle, and so we've just had the Talanoa dialogue, or facilitative dialogue, at the COP in Poland, which was about bringing everybody together to see what we have done so far, how far we can go, but also the IPCC 1.5 degrees report fed into that, again, to get the big societal debate in terms of where we need to go. And in 2023, there will be a much larger global stock take, and we're already preparing that within the Commission. Our counterparts in the Chinese government, we're already discussing how we do the analysis to feed into that. And that will be very important in terms of getting an increase in the collective ambition to get us on the right track. Also very important is that we have a global climate action agenda, because this is not just about the governments, it's about everybody. And that is where the rest of society gets involved. So whether it's sub-national level, so cities and provinces or states in the US have been very, very important. They are acting and taking things forward. But also, in this case, the school children, but also obviously very much business, but also universities, NGOs. It's really a very important area of work. This is to show you what this means in terms of the cycle. So what you see here is going from Kyoto Protocol to Paris Agreement. You have the financial pledge on the front top, the timeline, and then what you can see here is the process of reporting on what each party is doing, but also where the science comes in to inform the process. And so you see that we have regular stops along the way where we take stock of the ambition and, sorry, I won't do that because I'll probably, but it's a process which is a continuous improvement process. So in Katowice, this is what we were aiming for, is to get a robust rule book agreed. And what is the rule book? Well, the rule book is, as we said, the set of rules, but it contains a number of different elements. And these were our aims, and what we were trying to do was to avoid stepping back from the balance achieved at the Paris Agreement, but while at the same time making sure that we had all the elements contained in there which we need. And in terms of the elements, very important is the transparency framework. We've been working on this for years. So that the Chinese played a major role because the group which did this was co-led by a Chinese expert. And we've worked very closely with them, very well with them. What's important is that everybody has the same basis. So people are using the IPCC 2006 guidelines, which means that by having a common rule book with common guidelines, we can actually aggregate the information in the reporting. Otherwise, if people are reporting on different bases, it's very difficult to get a real sense of where the world is going. And it also then allows people to have a better understanding of what other people are presenting, because they're presenting in the same way themselves. What was very important also is that we extended the reporting not just to the mitigation, but it also includes reporting on what we do on adaptation, because that's really crucial, because we will have climate change we can't avoid and we need to adapt. And it's also important to understand what is best practice, but also where people need support. And part of the really important factors in getting an agreement on this rule book was making sure that everybody meets the same sets of, has the same guidelines, does the same sort of thing, but those countries which don't have the capacity right now to do the modelling, to do the data collection and so on, that they can say so, but say very clearly why they can't do so, so that the donors, so countries within the EU and elsewhere who are providing money to support Paris Agreement action, can then target that money to help those countries be able to do this. So in terms of I won't go into a lot of detail because there's not enough time, but the accounting guidance is very, very important, and we also need to make sure that we don't have double counting, and that's one of the issues which came up very strongly, and also one of the reasons why one of the areas wasn't agreed in the rulebook, which was the markets area, because we really need to make sure that we have very sound accounting rules for carbon markets, which ensure that there are not situations where emissions might be being counted twice. For example, within an NDC, outside an NDC, or for example, within an NDC and in an ICAO CORSIA context, which is the system being set up for carbon markets in the international aviation sector. We need to make sure that we're not misleading people. And that's also maybe illustrates why the rule book and the transparency side is so important, because we need everybody to trust that people are doing what they say they're doing. Whether it's parties in the agreement or whether it's people in carbon markets, in different contexts, that's really important. So this is to get onto the carbon market issue. There are three big areas which were being discussed on carbon markets. The Article 6, and for people working in carbon markets, you probably heard a lot about this. Basically, the first point was about just the accounting processes. The second was about setting up a new market mechanism where we no longer will be relying on CDM and JI. So what will the new market mechanisms look like? But also how you address non-market approaches. There were a couple of countries who were concerned about reliance on markets, such as Venezuela, I think it was Nicaragua, or Bolivia. And this is about looking at alternatives around carbon markets to make them feel comfortable about talking about carbon markets in this context. I mentioned the Global Climate Action Agenda, or the Marrakesh Partnership Agenda. These are the mechanisms set in place after Paris to engage the whole of society. And I think this is a really important area, and if you go to a COP now, the amount of activity around the partnerships is really important. And what happened also in Katowice was that they agreed, or basically setting up a yearbook, setting up information resources platforms or improving platforms to make sure that people can get access more easily to the good examples which are out there, so that people can show more easily what they are doing, even if they're not parties. So for example, in the US, where the Trump administration is not really acting in favor of the climate, there are many, many other stakeholders who are very active. And this is a really important forum for all those players. So even if the parties are not doing sufficient work, that it's possible for everybody else to do so. Is it going forward? Okay. Right. I want to just quickly to move on to something which was published at the end of November by the European Commission. It's the proposal for the EU's 2050 emissions reduction strategy. So under the Paris Agreement, all parties must develop mid-century strategies which are submitted by 2020. And this is the process by which the EU is launching the debate. So this was requested from the Commission. The Commission and the European system has the right of initiative. We propose, so this is our proposal. It will then go into debate between the Member States and Parliament. That started now, and our colleagues have been travelling around the world. They were in Beijing, Seoul and Tokyo just this last week, presenting this to governments and stakeholders in this part of the world. And what we have presented is a vision for a climate neutral society and economy by 2050. And the reason we want to do this is we want to lead by example. We want to be one of the first regions to do this. And what we have done over many years is to do the analysis and do the work with stakeholders to show that this is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible. And so what we have done is to work, yeah. So in this report, and the communication looks like this. We have a limit on the number of pages. There's also a big analytical document behind it of more than 400 pages. I have some QR codes with me, which if you want to get hold of them, you can scan them. The communication also exists in Chinese for people who would be interested in that. But what you will find in there is all the details or summary of the analysis. But what they did was look at 8 different scenarios. And so the names of the scenarios along the top, and you can see what they involve. There was one scenario that looked at electrification of all sectors. One scenario that looks at hydrogen, the use of hydrogen as a new different alternative fuel source. One looking at power to X, so where e-fuels are developed when there's excess renewables capacity, for example. One looking at full uptake of energy efficiency, because we know there's lots of energy efficiency opportunity and it's just not being taken up. So really driving that energy efficiency agenda to people really taking up these opportunities. Another scenario looking at circular economy. And in each of these 5 scenarios, they looked at pushing that to the extreme, what it would do. And then they looked at one scenario, which is the combination, the combo scenario, where they took each of those to a lesser extent and combined them. And what you find is in the ones pushing the existing technologies, sort of feasible technologies now to the limit, you get to about 80% reduction in the EU. So still not quite there. With the combo, you get to around 90%, but it's not doing what we need it to do. So what they then did is look at 2 more scenarios at the end, where they combine that combination scenario, the things we're doing now, with 2 things. One is looking at BECCS and CCS, so looking at the full potential for the bioeconomy with carbon capture and storage. And then the final scenario was to push circular economy even further. I mean, really intense circular economy. And both these scenarios take you to carbon neutrality in 2050. So they require a lot of work across a number of different areas. But basically, and if you look at the report, it goes into a lot of detail, but it's sort of pushing fully on energy efficiency, deployment of renewables, really pushing deployment of renewables, and of course working on the storage capacity to make that possible, a 6-fold increase in storage capacity. Clean, safe and connected mobility. So electrified passenger transport, electrification in almost all sectors, maybe some hydrogen in the heavy goods vehicles. And the only transport area where this is more difficult, where we still assume some fuel use, is in the aviation sector. So, and there are a couple of other sectors like that where you still need some fossil fuel use, which is why you need the carbon capture and storage. It's also a strategy for a competitive industry. It's about investment in industry, investment in modernization, investment in technology, but also the circular economy, because there's so much resource inefficiency, and it's really important that we make best use of the resources we're wasting for the competitiveness of the economy, and also for creating good quality jobs. It's a lot of investment in infrastructure, for example, interconnections, transport, electricity, but many other areas. And a big focus on bioeconomy and sinks. And this is also obviously an area where there's going to be a huge need for improvements in efficiency, because there's a lot of competition for land. So this is an area where there's a real focus still in terms of how we do this better. And the last resort is to use carbon capture and storage to mop up what we can't avoid. This is maybe less carbon capture and storage than people maybe were assuming, but it's still there and it's very important. The enabling framework we discuss in a lot of detail. I can't go into a lot of detail here because I think we're probably being told I'm out of time completely, but it's very much about almost all areas of EU policy. So this is not just about climate policy, it's also about looking at how we do taxation, looking at our budgets. We also do a lot of our budget is already set aside for climate action, but there's a big focus on how you spend that money, on the digitalization, on circular economy, and in research and innovation. Yeah, I won't go maybe into that in too much detail right now. What it means is an increase in investment in the EU economy, but not a massive increase in investment. It's right now about 2% of EU GDP is invested in the energy system. We're talking about 2.8% by over the years to get to this 2050 scenario. So it's doable. It's not infeasible. It's a large amount of money, but it does require shifts in how we where the finance goes, basically where the money goes. But it is doable. the scenario, it's important to note, is positive for jobs, and it's also good for higher quality jobs. And we have many important co-benefits. One of the most important is that the EU is very reliant on fossil fuel imports. Reducing those imports is very important for our security, for our economy. It also has very important impacts in terms of public health, because we still have air quality issues, especially in some of our big cities, which are creating big health damages and damage the productivity of the economy, and this helps address those. And in terms of the impacts of GDP, these are the top lines show you the different scenarios and different models. But the dotted line is sort of business as usual, and these are different models give you different. But you're seeing that the impact on the GDP trajectory is minimal. However, what you see is what's happening to the emissions at the bottom, and that's really important. So we're really talking about a big transition across economy and across society. What's important is that it's a fair transition. And we talked about the yellow vests, and you can see the importance of getting it right in terms of how we target the policies, how we use fiscal policy, how we use our social policies alongside climate policies to make sure that we're not imposing excessive costs on people who can't afford it, to make sure also that we're providing them with viable alternatives if we're looking at increasing their costs of using fossil fuel-based transport, that we're putting the investment in to the public transport, the clean mobility, to give them alternatives. And just to show you down here, these are some of the, if you look at the two maps at the bottom, the left-hand one is where you have coal jobs. And so, of course, jobs in the coal mining industry will disappear. Relatively speaking, there are a very small number of jobs compared to the overall employment in the EU. But in those areas where they will disappear, it has an impact. And so it's really important to focus on those areas. Similarly, the automotive sector. The automotive sector, this is the importance of the automotive sector, the graph on the right. So the transition in the automotive sector is going to be an issue which will need to be managed. And so these are the sorts of things we want to make people aware of through this strategy and start the work now, because we need to start now to get everything in place to make this transition possible. And of course, this is not just about the EU. EU is now down to about 10% of global emissions. And so, of course, we're not going to do this alone. So this is about showing what is possible, making sure that our economy is strong and we have good employment in our economy, but it's also about working with others to deal with the global climate problem, and that's why I work in Beijing. That's why my colleagues are going around the world talking to people about what can be done, and we work very closely with the analysts in many countries, so we work very closely with modelers, including at Tsinghua, on how you get a good analysis to support policymakers in making the right decisions. Well, as I said, it starts a debate, and this is they were very happy to get an agreement in Katowice.